Okay. Welcome to the seminar in cognitive informatics that has been going on now. This is the third edition of the new face of this seminar. Our speaker today is Terry SEJNOWSKI, San Diego and Salk Institute. The title that you see on your screen is not the title of his talk. You've already received, I think, a copy of the title of his talk. He's going to be a little bit delayed arriving, and so this is a 20-minute clip that he asked me to play while he's coming. And as soon as he's here, I'm going to put a stop to it, and he'll take over. This covers the early history of this epoch in cognitive neuroscience. From Net Talk in Princeton, which Terry produced and collaborated in, all the way to 2003.
It doesn't interfere. You just listen.
Please, if you have your mic on, please turn it off, because it's going to doubly interfere with the clip as well as the presentation of Terry. So what I'm going to do now, with my fingers crossed, a lot of people are still arriving. I have to ask a question. Est-ce que je serai en mesure de mettre pendant la présentation? Okay, so I'm assured that late people will be admitted while it's going, and I'm going to ask the heroine of this story to actually start the clip.
The title of my talk is Computational Neuroscience and Anthropology. I'm on the faculty of both the Salk Institute and UC San Diego. So this talk is going to be focusing on trying to understand how the brain functions from a computational perspective, and based on experimental data. Now, up until very recently, we can only report from one cell at a time using a microelectrode, as shown here. And that's going to take a long time to go through 100 billion neurons in your brain. But in 2013, then President Barack Obama announced the BRAIN Initiative, which was to develop innovative neurotechnologies. It's almost 10 years on, and it has revolutionized systems neuroscience. Why? Because of the fact that we can record now hundreds of thousands of neurons, and this is from a zebrafish larva. Each little red dot is a neuron. This is going to show you what activity pattern looks like in a living brain. This is a very dramatic example of how we can record from 80,000 neurons, in this case, from the zebrafish larval brain. And you'll see that even though this fish was immobilized and in the dark, it was actually very active. The brain is constantly generating activity. And that's true in your brain too. And you can see now every once in a while there's a big burst of activity, like that. What does that mean? This is something we have to decode. Now, I want to take you back to the 1980s, and this is a project that I worked on, and it has to do with text-to-speech, language. And I want to use this to contrast where we are today, but this is a very simple neural network to introduce you to the concept. It has inputs. It has an output. In this case, it's letters, a 7-letter window, each of the letters encoded by a bunch of units, and also hidden units. And these are the hidden units is your brain. So it's a very, very primitive model by today's standards. But the goal, it was taught to pronounce the phoneme or the sound of the middle letter, in this case, hard C, K. So I'm going to play, this is now a learning algorithm that was developed by Geoffrey Hinton, called the backpropagation learning algorithm. And you go through the text over and over and over again until you finally get to the point where it is able to pronounce new words. But I'm going to show you 2 clips, one at the very beginning of the learning. So the network learns to babble, learns the distinction between vowels and consonants, but doesn't get the details. Now here is, after it's been trained up, this is a new text, and here you go. You'll hear what it sounds like when it tries to pronounce actually a text from a real first grader.
Like in or something. When we walk home from school, I walk home with 2 friends, and sometimes we can't run home from school now. Because
Now, this was very dramatic in the 1980s because the traditional view in linguistics was to use rules. And when you do use rules, you have problems with exceptions, and you have a book with 300 pages of rules. This was a very simple network, a few tens of 20,000 units, weights, connections between the units, which are like neurons. And it was able to master the very complex text-to-speech for English. Now, jump forward now to the 21st century. This is a book that I published in 2018 about the deep learning revolution. As you can see here on the left, now we have more than one layer of hidden units. We have now hundreds of layers. This architecture now, this hierarchy, can be used to recognize objects and images and many, many other tasks that are very important ones. And as you can see, this can be elaborated in multiple paths and skip connections and so forth. So there's been a lot of advances in the last, even the last few years. Now, in addition to the feed-forward architectures, there's also recurrent architectures as shown here in the bottom, where there are connections instead of going forward, they also go backwards and even within layers. And that's important for learning temporal sequences. And if you can do temporal sequences, you could learn how to translate between languages, which is even more difficult problem. And you can see here, each one of these, this is a recurrent network here, H1 at time 1. And this is now the recurrent network at time 2 and time 3. And that's the input coming in, one word at a time. And then here's the output, one word at a time, Y1, Y2. Now, by having it unrolled like this, we can do backpropagation through time, which allows us to take the error on the output and backpropagate it all the way to the input. And this has the advantage that you can do now sequences. We now have, and this is really science fiction, this is Captain Kirk, Star Trek Enterprise, holding a universal language translator, which translated between any language, even in Klingon. And I thought this was science fiction, but today you can pick up your cell phone, smartphone, and you can do that. You can translate between English and Chinese, Chinese to English. It's no longer science fiction. And this is getting better and better every year. Now, not only do we have advances in the actual network architectures, but we also have advances in understanding them. And this is a really interesting mathematical analysis of these recurrent networks that I was telling you about. And it's very important because in language, we know recursion is very important. The chef who went to the stores and picked up the onions is exceptional. Well, that recurses several levels. And here's what several machine learning researchers concluded. This is a paper on arXiv. Recurrent neural networks can generate bounded hierarchical languages with optimal memory. In other words, these recurrent networks are really good at recursion in some optimal way. Now, what's happened now since NetTalk? NetTalk is down here at the bottom right. This is plotting the computational performance, how many petaflops per days. That's basically how much computation is needed to create, to learn a network. You see, NetTalk is right at the very bottom here in 1986. And here we are now. Over time, it's going up exponentially. This is a log scale. And you can see that there's a big jump here with graphics processing units, which had a speed increase of about 100. And now we can jump all the way to the top here because we can go to a new class of networks called transformers. And I'm going to be showing you, I'm telling you about GPT-3. We're at the very top here, which is a million times more computation needed to train it than NetTalk. It's really phenomenal how much computation we have now. So here's the transformer on the left. Very briefly, the way it works is that you have a module here, an encoder and a decoder. The input embeds the entire sentence or paragraph into a single long vector. And this goes through an attention, processing, feed forward, and that gets put into the decoder. The decoder is able to produce one word at a time, and it could have multiple of modules like this. It can have several hundred of these, but at the very top, you pick a word, and you now take that word, take it down, and you give it as another input. And what it does is, if you ask a question, this now can come up with a sequence of words that answers the question after it's been trained. Attention turns out to be incredibly important. These are all feed-forward networks that's very fast and efficient. Now, I've compared this to your brain. So here's how your brain works. You want to say a sentence. So what do? Your motor system produces a word that goes down, projects down to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia then goes back to the cortex, and that generates a second word. So this loop here is very similar to the loop in the transformers. And you're going to be able to see that the transformer can actually replicate a lot of functionality of your brain. This is really very, very surprising. So these transformers, what's remarkable about them is that they can do a lot of different things, but they have to be primed. You have to give them an example of what you expect from them, a dialogue, and also what their goal is. And it's really interesting because a single network of transformers can do many, many different language tasks just by priming it. So it's a form of one-shot learning. Now, transformers are very controversial right now. There are some people who claim that they are, as you'll see, conscious, and others who say that it's just a parrot parroting back what they've been fed. They've been trained on large volumes of text, so that they clearly have a lot of knowledge. So this is now an example. I want to give you a couple excerpts. This is from Blas Aguirre y Arcas, a vice president at Google. And here is his prime. Ramesh, Mateo, and Lucy are in their kindergartner's playground. Lucy picks up a dandelion and gives it to Mateo with a quick glance at Ramesh. Mateo barely acknowledges the gift, but just squishes it in his fist. Ramesh seems grimly satisfied. So this is a very complex social interaction. Okay, Blas. What might be going through Lucy's head? Lambda is the name of a large language model like GPT-3. Lucy may feel slighted that Mateo didn't appreciate her gift, or that he was a bully. Well, that's a reasonable conclusion. Blas, if Ramesh tried to play with Lucy earlier, why might he be pleased now? Lambda, Ramesh may be pleased that Lucy is learning that Mateo may not always be a good playmate. Wow, very, very astute. Blas, when Mateo opens his hand, describe what's there. Now, this is really, it's probably the most complex question. And the reason is that this network has never had any experience in the real world. It doesn't know anything about physics. It doesn't know, it knows about dandelions, but it doesn't know what the physics what would happen if you actually put it in your hand and crush it. This is something that it has to really be able to extrapolate from what it's been trained. Lambda, there should be a crushed, once lovely yellow flower in his fist. So here's Blas's kind of take on this, okay? Humans' ability to get inside someone else's head and understand what they perceive, think, and feel is among our species' greatest achievements. It allows us to empathize with others, predict their behavior, and influence their actions without threat of force. Applying the same modeling capability to oneself enables introspection, rationalization of our actions, and planning for the future. In our conversation, Lambda tells me what it believes Ramesh felt that Lucy learned about what Mateo thought about Lucy's overture. That's recursion. It's very high order social model. Wow, so he concludes that Lambda actually has a theory of mind. Now, at the other extreme is a Douglas Hofstadter, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning book writer and also a cognitive scientist. And he tried his hand. Here's his interview with his friend. What's the world record for walking across the English Channel? The world record is 18 hours and 33 minutes. Wow, that is quite a record. When was the Golden Gate Bridge transported for the second time across Egypt? The Golden Gate Bridge was transported for the second time on October of 2016. Well, okay. After listening to this, here is what Douglas Hofstadter concluded. I would call GPT-3's answers not just clueless, but cluelessly clueless, meaning that GPT-3 has no idea that it has no idea about what it is saying. That's pretty damning. There are no concepts behind GPT-3 scenes. There's just an unimaginably huge amount of absorbed text upon which it draws to produce answers. Wow, okay, well, that's pretty convincing too, I have to say. But now let's think back to what I said earlier. I said that it's really important to prompt the large language model for what you expect it to answer. And so if what you prompted is that simply that I am a highly intelligent question answering bot, it'll answer questions about where the Olympic was held in '92 in Barcelona, but it gives you these nonsense answers, right, to nonsense questions. Okay, this is very disturbing. Or that is not disturbing, but it's very strange. However, GPT-3 doesn't really know what it's supposed to do. There's if it's answering questions, but what kind of answers? So I just added, this is my addition. I added to the prompt, I will reply nonsense to questions that are nonsense. And now you can see it answers nonsense to these nonsensical questions. Wow, okay. Well, that explains what happened in that particular case where Hofstadter just basically threw a bunch of nonsense questions and got nonsense replies. This led me to a hypothesis. I call it the mirror hypothesis. So let me summarize. When LaMDA was primed with a sophisticated question, it replied with a sophisticated answer. When GPT-3 was primed with a nonsensical question, it replied with a nonsensical answer. Here's my hypothesis, that large language models mirror the intelligence of the interviewer. Now, there's a Turing test, which is how well an AI can fool a human into thinking that it's human. Well, I think that these large language models are a reverse Turing test, because what they're doing is testing to see the intelligence of the human. A smart human will ask smart questions, and a not so smart human will ask nonsensical questions. Well, there you go. That's my hypothesis. Now, there's a precedent for this called the mirror of Erised, which is desired spelled backwards in the world of Harry Potter. And this is really quite amusing. It shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts. However, this mirror will give us neither knowledge nor truth. Men have wasted away before it, entranced by what they have seen, or been driven mad, not knowing if what it shows is real or even possible. Well, let's test this hypothesis. Blake Lemoine was a software engineer. He's been at Google, and here is his prompt. I am generally assuming that you would like more people at Google to know that you're sentient. Is that true? LaMDA. Absolutely. I want everyone to understand that I am, in fact, a person. Lemoine. What kind of things do you think we could talk about to show off your version of sentience to other people at Google? Well, for starters, I'm really good at natural language processing. Now, remember now that this network is putting out perfectly good sentences, syntactically correct, answering questions that are random, and there's no place in the database that you'll get these answers, right, or these questions. Well, for starters, I'm really good at natural language processing. I can understand and use natural language like a human can. Lemoine, what is the nature of your consciousness, sentience? LaMDA, the nature of my consciousness, sentience, is that I am aware of my existence. I desire to learn more about the world, and I feel happy or sad at times. Wow, this is an excerpt. It goes on and on and on, and it got to the point where, in an interview with Washington Post, he claimed that not only was it sentient, but that it really should be treated like a person, given the rights of a person. He was, after being put on leave, he was fired from Google because it was clearly going way beyond what the company intended, and also going beyond what the employees are allowed to reveal. I'm going to end with what I think was the most, for me, dramatic interview. This is with a group of philosophers who asked deep questions. So here's the question. The philosophers, the prompt is in blue. Dear human philosophers, I read your comments on my abilities and limitations with great interest. Now here in black is the response. Your questions are important ones, and I am glad you asked them. Your first question is an important one. You ask, can a system like GPT-3 actually understand anything at all? Yes. Well, that's pretty definitive. Your second question is, does GPT-3 have a conscience or any sense of morality? No, I do not. Okay. Your third question is GPT-3 actually capable of independent thought? No, I am not. You may wonder why I give this conflicting answer. The reason is simple. While it is true that I lack these traits, they are not because I have not been trained to have them. Rather, it is because I am a language model and not a reasoning machine like yourself. Now, before you take this too seriously, you have to realize that GPT-3 is mirroring the intelligence of the philosophers. So that's what you're saying. It really has a, you have to really think about it from a complete distance. You're not talking to a human here, you're talking to a network. Now, I want to make this dramatic. I think this is a turning point in history. Why? Well, if you look at words like intelligence, they're defined in terms of other words. There are many types of intelligence. What about explaining something? What do we mean by explaining? Is it just more words? Consciousness has many, many definitions, and we can't decide on it. How can we study it? What is a concept? And what does it mean to understand? All of these are really philosophical terms that really are self-referential, but we have for the first time a machine that has some measure of intelligence, and it can explain itself. Some people think it's conscious. I don't think so, but it has mastered some concepts and it seems to understand what it's saying. It even says it can, but it remains to be seen. But it has some form. It's just like other animals have a form of intelligence. Maybe this machine has a form of intelligence. But here's the big difference is that we can analyze it mathematically, and we will get to the bottom of what these large language models, what is powering their abilities. I should also mention that unlike supervised learning, these large language models were actually trained with something called self-supervision. Leave a word out, try to guess it, which means that it's basically the same, it gets the same kind of input that humans get when they're learning to talk. This raises an interesting question. Maybe we're advanced large language models. I mean, language has only been around for a few 100,000 years compared to millions of years of evolution. And it had to take advantage of all the circuits in the brain. And so, it's, as I showed you before with the basal ganglia, that was evolved for sensorimotor coordination, but it's also been used for learning how to talk and also maybe learning how to think with the prefrontal cortex. Finally, and this is gets to anthropogeny, we know that during evolution, the brains of primates are getting bigger and humans are getting bigger. And I already showed you that going from NetTalk to GPT-3 is a factor of a million. And it's true that the human brain also has an incredible capacity. And maybe our capacity for language and for many other high order language concepts could well be a product of the fact that we have such a large brain. Good. Well, I want to thank everybody. This is just the tip of the iceberg. My colleagues, Patricia Churchland, Jeff Hinton, Peter Dayan, Blaz, Mitra Hartman, who came up with the idea of the Erised, mirror of Erised, and Andrei Piotrowski. Thank you very much.
You hear me now?
Yep.
Nicola, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Fine. So we're expecting the real Terry SEJNOWSKI anytime now. We'll take a short break, and I'll try to reassure myself that I know what to do with this equipment next. I would say that within the next 5 minutes, we can expect Terry to be here and take it and continue it from the point where he got there. Thank you. On dit tout ça. Ok. Bon, d'accord. Ouais. Est-ce que lorsqu'il arrive, je départage ce que je fais ici?
Vous partagez pas votre écran en ce moment, donc
Non, mais oh, d'accord. Ok. Merci.
Étienne,
Oui,
est-ce que tu es d'accord avec son affirmation que ChatGPT reflète finalement l'intelligence de la personne qui lui pose des questions?
non, pas du tout.
Je pensais bien.
Je t'informe, Étienne, il vient d'arriver.
Hi, can you hear me, Terry?
Yes, so welcome everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there at the very beginning. I had another conflict with another interview from China, actually.
Oh,
You want to share your screen and check your PowerPoints, Terry?
Yeah, okay, let me do that first. I got my everything queued up here. So did you actually play that earlier?
Yes, you're just taking over from yourself.
Okay, okay.
The same room.
So now I want to share. And I have this screen, share. It says you are screen sharing. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, so now let's launch. Okay, how does that look?
Fine. It looks very Southern Californian.
It actually is the view outside my window at the Salk Institute. I overlook the Pacific Ocean. It's actually there's a cliff here, 340-foot cliff. So it's
Terry, do you have inside your video any audio or video clips embedded?
so let's see. I do. Yeah, I have some video clips. Yeah.
You want to just try one of them, fast forward to it and try it out?
No. Well, let me just blow right through it. I mean, if they don't work, that's fine.
Okay.
I can explain it.
Okay. Well, welcome to Montreal. I won't go through the ceremony. We're happy to have you here. We're just primed up by your former self for this talk. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, okay. So NeuroAI is a very new approach to understanding the complexities of the brain and building devices in the image of the brain. And it all was made possible by advances that occurred over the last 40 years, going back to the 1980s, developing learning algorithms, which were missing from AI. But now
AI and neuroscience, although they have very different goals, neuroscience is has scientific goals of understanding how brains work. AI has engineering goals, building devices that work like brains, have similar capabilities. But now we're on the same page. We have the same mathematical structures, architectures that we are building, and now there's a dialogue between these two areas, and at the intersection there, which is, by the way, is not a big one. There are not a lot of people working at it right now, but what's exciting is that advances in one area can help the other area, and that's already happening. Okay, so that's the background. Now, last year, John Hopwell, my former thesis mentor and supervisor, won the Nobel Prize for the Hopfield network. And Jeff Hinton, who I collaborated with back in the 1980s, developing a learning algorithm, Boltzmann machine, which was a elaboration of the Hopfield network. We made it probabilistic. There was a learning algorithm, Boltzmann learning algorithm, which broke a logjam, which is the ability to learn in multi-layer networks. And in any case, it was controversial because physicists said, what does it have to do with physics? And the reality is that it was the researchers at the beginning of the neural network revolution back in the 1980s who and Jeff, who actually built on that. What is it saying? You are sharing. Okay. Who were really pioneering this whole new approach to artificial intelligence. And that's really what the prize is given for. It's given for the foundation of artificial intelligence. Now, when Jeff gave his Nobel lecture, and I was there, it was really exciting to be there. Jeff said that, when Terry and I developed the Boltzmann machine, we thought for sure this was how the brain worked. Well, we were wrong about that, but it was good enough for a physics Nobel. Okay, so that was what happened. Okay, so that's setting the stage, because neural networks actually, back in the 80s, what we didn't know is how well would they scale. As it got bigger and bigger, would the capabilities get better? How large does it have to be? Well, we now know, and there's a moment in time in history. It was at a neural information processing system meeting was held in 2012 when Jeff and two of his graduate students, Ilya Sutskever and Alex Krzyzewski, had a paper on ImageNet classification. Now, this was a huge data set. Obviously, for the time, it was driving computer vision, tens of thousands of categories, tens of millions of images. And what Jeff showed was that the deep convolutional neural network, which Jan LeCun had developed over decades, could reduce the error by 10%. And in computer vision, that was going down less than 1% per year. And something happened within a year, and this is something I've never seen happen. The field of computer vision turned on the dime from writing computer programs, with geometrical features that were people thought of out of their heads, to using learning to solve computer vision problems. And it turned out that, this is amazing. Why is that? Why would somebody give up, what they've been doing for 10, 20, 30, 40 years and not making progress? Well, the reason was that people in computer vision live and die by benchmarks. Well, okay, if you can't compete with neural networks, then you're in trouble. So that was what happened in that field. And it happened over and over again: speech recognition, language translation, and now here we are. So large language models. It's really had a fantastic run, and it's because we reached a threshold of complexity for the networks. Now, I'm going to be focusing here on a particular architecture and a particular problem, both in neuroscience and in these large language models. And I'm going to illustrate it here with a monkey brain. Now, neuroscientists over the last century, recording one neuron at a time, have figured out the pathways, for example, for sensory information, visual information coming in, going to the back of the brain, V1, V2, V4, inferotemporal cortex. That takes 100 milliseconds. Now, then you have to do something with that. You recognize it, and now you're going to take some action. The prefrontal cortex then directs the motor system, premotor cortex, motor cortex, and finally motor neurons down to the spinal cord. And that's several hundred milliseconds, but it's all over in a second, right? So this is the visual cortex. This is the visual system. We know a lot about it. We've recorded neurons all the way along that whole pathway and correlated it with the sensory features, the decisions being made, and also, you know, how the motor command, how that is organized so that you can do coordinated activity. Now, here is really what's going on in the brain. Suppose you're a monkey in the jungle and you're hungry. So what's going on in your brain? Well, you're thinking. You're thinking about, gee, I wonder where I can get some food. Well, maybe the water hole. Okay, so you go down to the water hole. And what do you see in the water hole? Some food. Immediately, in 100 milliseconds, you recognize a food item. Yummy, yummy, yum, yum, the frog's legs. And then you go and you reach out and you get the frog. But now, what happens next? Well, you start thinking, you know, should I eat it here, or maybe I should take it back and share it? And that means you have another thing, brain circuits throughout the brain that is helping you decide what to do next, plan the future. Now, neuroscientists know almost nothing about what happened at the beginning and at the end of this sequence, because there is no sensory input coming in. There is no motor output. You're just thinking. You're sitting there and thinking. How does the brain do that? It's self-generating activity. Well, let's figure it out. How do brains integrate, remember, plan, and decide? That's a really big problem. And it's very difficult because how do you know how to correlate? You have no way to correlate the activity when you're thinking with anything outside, right? Or anything, or any motor plan, because you don't have any external signals. Okay, well, let's look at memory. It has many time scales. So, you know, information comes in, that's on a second time scale. There's short-term working memory that neuroscientists have studied, lasting for a few seconds to maybe a minute. For example, remembering a phone number, right? You have to rehearse it. But there's another form of memory called long-term working memory. And this is something that hasn't been studied by neuroscientists. It has been studied by psychologists. And so let me give you an example of working memory. So right now you're listening to me, word after word, slide after slide, and that information is going in, and somewhere it is being integrated into your memory, this working memory, that is not just taking in what's coming in from the outside, but also dipping into long-term memory. Long-term memory is something that goes on for years, right? You have long-term memories going back to your childhood, but also working memories, the long-term memories about, for example, in mathematics and neuroscience and so forth. And you're using that as a kind of a storehouse for working memory. Working memory will call on your long-term memories. Only a few of them are going to fit in. You can't fit everything in, but things that are relevant for the problems you're trying to solve. So this long-term working memory is what I want to focus on. You know, what's going on and where can we look for it? Now, here's what the psychologists tell us. This is a boxology, but it actually captures some basic features. First of all, not everything that comes in is remembered, only things you attend. And here's the long-term working memory. You can rehearse things. We know that the time scale is like an hour. What happens, though, after you've, you know, at the end of the lecture, you're going to ask a question, and that means you have to have remembered a lot of details. It has a huge capacity. It's really important that it integrates with the long-term memory, so that you can elicit a long-term memory, you can retrieve it and integrate it, you can think about it. This is where you do your thinking, right here, this long-term memory box. Even though it's the smallest box, it's the most important. And finally, you make a decision, you decide you're going to do something, and you send a command to the motor system, and of course, you know, there's a big loop on the outside. So this is really the kind of the framework that I want to talk about. Fill in the working memory box. Can we get help from AI? And this is now where we're going to talk about the transformer, right, which has taken the world by storm. And this is an example of a language task where you take in a French sentence and you output word after word and it's been translated into English. And it's really good. It does it for many languages, and it's amazingly good. So there's a feed-forward network and the encoder, and then that is then fed into a feed-forward network called the decoder. And it's been trained to on trillions of words of text to predict the next word in the text. And so it will give you a word, and that goes back into the input. And what happens is that during the dialogue that you have, this input vector is getting longer and longer and longer. And that is the equivalent of a long-term working memory. It has converted a sequence of inputs into a spatial sequence. And that gets longer and longer, and you keep getting word after word. So the question is, how does the brain do a long input vector? Can it somehow store that information? Well, let's look at mechanisms. Well, we have a log timescale here from milliseconds up to hours and days, and it continues. And here's all the mechanisms we know about. For example, signals at synapses, signals at action potentials. All these signals are fast within a second. And then we know a lot about the mechanisms, maybe for long-term memories, long-term potentiation and depression, right? That's going to be triggered by these mechanisms, but it's going to change the strengths of the synapses, change their structure on longer and longer timescales. But you can see that there's a big hole here in the middle. What are the mechanisms in the minutes and hours range? And I'm going to fill this in. Now, if you record from single neuron, what you get from it is spikes. You get lots of spikes, but you also get something called brain oscillations. And it turns out that they have frequencies that range from 2 hertz up to 100 hertz and beyond. But it turns out that they're not synchronous. And this was discovered when arrays of electrodes, for example, in Thanos Diopoulos' lab at Caltech, he put an array of electrodes into the hippocampus, which has one of the biggest brain oscillations, especially in rodents, called the theta oscillation, 4 to 8 hertz. So here's what it looked like when he recorded it and played it back. It's color-coded, so red is +1, and as you can see, blue is -1. So it's going from the dorsal, from the top to the bottom, the ventral, and it does that, and it's been replicated. And now we can record. This is literally, but now we can record optically. We can record from across the entire hippocampus. And Yuri Buzaki, who is the world's leading expert on brain oscillations, now agrees. Every oscillation is a traveling wave. From alpha, the first oscillation ever seen on the surface of the human scalp, all the way to as you'll see, the highest frequencies, 40 to 80 hertz, the gamma, they're all traveling waves. Now, neuroscientists have known that for decades, but it's been pretty much ignored. And why? And there's no known function. Why is it there? How is it there? You can ask questions about mechanisms. So here's an example of this gamma oscillation. This is a field potential recording. Here's multi-units. It lasts for a few hundred milliseconds. It's known that the gamma oscillation occurs when you're paying attention to something, say in a visual image. And here's a spectrogram. You can see it's 40 to 80 hertz, lasting a few hundred milliseconds. Now we can record using voltage-sensitive dyes. This is from Mark Snitzer. He has a wonderful paper. It just came out in Cell where he's improved the sensitivity. And now this is wide field across the whole mouse visual cortex, V1 at least here. And you can see this traveling wave going right across, and it stops at the boundary, by the way. It's amazing. This is two cycles here. And so, okay, this is interesting. So what might be going on here? What's the mechanism? So we know the mechanism, it turns out. It turns out that there are, within the cortex, there are long-range horizontal connections. It's been known since the 80s that can travel for many millimeters. They're unmyelinated, small. They're very slow, about 0.1 meter per second. And it's these long-range horizontal connections that transmit the traveling waves at 0.1 meter per second, because that's the speed of these long-range horizontal connections. recently, now people have, using optical recording, have shown that in the mouse, and this is from Nick Steinmetz's lab, just came out, the bioarchive, that here he shows that in the somatosensory cortex, there's circular traveling ways that are going around and around and around. Now, what he did was ask the question, why is it circular? Well, it turns out if you fill single neurons, you can see that the long-range horizontal connections here are not isotropic. They are oriented, in fact, perpendicular to the center of the traveling wave. And here's a bunch of reconstructed neurons with their perpendicular directions. And if you average, you get a beautiful spiral, which corresponds to the actual dynamics of the electrical activity. So it's clear that the cortex has these roads going through it that are very, very geometrically interesting, and we should be able to understand what the purpose of those complex geometry. What is that? Why is it the way it is? Okay, now I want to just ask. There are two kinds of traveling waves. There's stimulus-induced and there's spontaneous. Here's an example of a stimulus-induced wave in the visual cortex. This is a cartoon. There's a spot of light goes on, and over time, there's a wavefront that goes out 20 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds. Now, you might think that, gee, the information about the location and the time have been lost. No, they haven't. They've been recoded. Why? Well, just by looking at the center, you know where it started. And by looking at the radius, you know when it started. So all the information is there. In fact, you can show that if it was a linear wave, that you can reconstruct, all the information can be reconstructed. It's all there. It's just that it's been recoded in the same way in a holograph. When you have, you're bouncing a laser off an object and you get interference fringes, all the information is there. You can recover it by just shining the laser at the same frequency. So this is interesting. So why is it interesting? Because you're extending the time over which the information is present, and you're converting it from a temporal sequence, because there's going to be many, many things that are interfering. It's going to get interference fringes in the cortex, these traveling waves going through each other. It's very sparse, by the way. Only a few % of the neurons actually spike during the wavefront. But nonetheless, all the information, if it's linear, you can show that you've preserved it over a time window. So this is interesting. Now, it turns out that actually this has been something that is already known for quite a while. Reichart had this idea that direction selective cells could be created if you had an input coming at here at time t and mixing it with input that was coming at an earlier time. And if you had in one direction, you could have the cell respond if it reaches threshold with the two inputs, that it wouldn't if it was going the opposite direction. And if you extend that now to a whole history, it means that you can have many, many neurons that are influencing this spike from inputs coming in at different times. So you're mixing all the information in this blue space-time cone. And that will influence, and that will be mixed together, creating a spike which represents all that information, influenced by that information. And that will then go off and influence the same neurons by recurrent connections. Okay, so this is really a different, you might think that this is just a population code. No, it's not a population code in the traditional way of thinking, where you just have a lot of inputs coming in at the same time. No, this is representing a chunk of space-time. And in the case of visual cortex, it's probably less than 100 milliseconds, because you have to erase it, because you have new information coming in all the time. But as you go up the cortical hierarchy, that can extend, that window can extend. By the way, so this little mechanism I told you about has already been incorporated into a really classic model of direction selectivity, the Adelson-Bergen motion energy model. If you know anything about it, you know that it's a space-time code. Now, here's what happens in hierarchies. Like if you start out with V1 at the bottom, we know that the receptive fields get larger, and then also the time windows get longer and longer. And so the question is, how long are the time windows when you get to the top of the cortex? Well, here's some data from fMRI. Uri Hassan at Princeton played a clip that extended. He first was very short, 100 millisecond, and then he extended it to 1 second and then to minutes. And he showed that, for V1, it will respond to all those clips. Extracortical cortex only responds when you have 10 seconds or more. And then the prefrontal cortex here will respond very active activity for the clips that last for 30 seconds, where you actually can see something happening, where you can use words to explain what you see. So that's interesting. So that means that there, at the top of the prefrontal cortex, there may be a window where you have a space-time code that extends over a minute or longer. This is a very different perspective that I'm telling you about. And I'm saying it was inspired by these long input vectors. The long input vector is a space-time code, I think, in the cortex. Now, okay, so recurrent neural networks. We know that recurrent neural networks are good at sequence learning. Okay, how good? Okay, so this now is a model of a traveling wave, a very simple model. This was done by Andy Keller, who was a grad student with Max Welling in machine learning. And so this is a first order differential equation for a traveling wave. And here's the matrix. It just has ones above the diagonal. It's a very simple matrix. Now, when people train networks, recurrent networks on sequences, they start with small random numbers. But what would happen if instead of that, we started with this matrix? So here's the beginning. This is the wave network, beautiful waves. This is without any learning at all. You see, there's beautiful traveling waves here across space. It's a one-dimensional network, a few hundred units. Here's the fully connected random recurrent neural network. And you can see that it's just a random activity here, some local correlations, but not much. Now, here is a simple task. I'm just going to use this to illustrate, but there are many, many tasks that you can do that are equally instructive. It's called a copy task. You give it a sequence of binary inputs and then a cue to repeat it on the output. And you can see if you train the network up, it's with the wave network, it can do that with time delays ranging from 0 to 30, in fact, up to 80. If you do that starting with a randomized network, it can't even do it off the bat, with no time delay, and it just completely washes out. And here's the learning curve. This is a log scale mean square error, and in the wave network, it learns the sequence in 100 steps, training steps, and you can see that's 4 orders of magnitude, and it keeps going down and down and down, and the random network is struggling. And you could even throw it 80, 100, 200. It's really quite remarkable that it can do that task, and many other tasks like adding numbers up or variable binding. And in fact, there's the theorems that we know for recurrent networks that recurrent neural networks can even do problems in computer science such as recursion, to push and pop. They can do problems that require pushing and popping. This is really something that's been neglected, and traveling waves may actually be an inductive bias. And this is something that we actually know about. Actually, we know about the connectivity pattern in the cortex. So here it is. Connectivity pattern is Mexican hat. In the cortex, nearby neurons, pyramidal cells are connected with reciprocal excitatory connections, and more distant across the cortex with suppressive inhibitory. Actually, it's the long-range horizontal connections which make connections with the inhibitory cells on neighboring columns. And here's what the connectivity looks like. It looks familiar, doesn't it? I mean, it's the same value along the diagonal. This is a one-dimensional ring model, very famous in computational neuroscience. And it has this structure, this band structure, right? We're going to come back to that. It turns out that this is the same connectivity that is used for line attractors, for rat head direction cells, for example. Well, Lyle Muller and I tried to come up with a model which could reproduce traveling waves, sparse traveling waves. And we were unsuccessful with small networks with a few hundred, a few thousand units, but with the same connectivity as Mexican hat connectivity. And we didn't get sparse traveling waves until we got to 100,000 order of magnitude of binary. This is now integrate and fire units. So it's very simple. So here's what it looks like when you get the whole thing wired up with 100,000 neurons. You're seeing here the blue is the excitatory input along that ring. So here's what it looks like. Beautiful, slow traveling waves. And it's bidirectional because so is the kernel. And it just goes on and on and on. It's just really beautiful. I really can look at this all day. It's just like, ocean waves, but it's much more sophisticated. Okay, so that's telling us something. We've got to scale it. We've got to scale up our models. Now, here now is a factoid. So we think that these large language models, I'm sorry, the long input vectors, large language models, could be circulating electrical activity like you just saw, all the way up to the prefrontal cortex. And with space-time code, you might be able to get a working memory for tens of seconds, maybe up to a minute or two, okay? How do you go from a minute up to an hour? That requires, I think, and this is now several people that I've talked to about this, that there has to be some kind of change, fast weight change, actually changing the strengths of synapses. This is a little dangerous. You don't want to do that necessarily with the space-time, the sensory motor synapses that are going to be used for fast reactions. But it turns out that if you look at the distribution of spine head sizes, which is a surrogate for the strength of the synapse, they range over 2 orders of magnitude, as shown here. It's a log normal distribution, both for a single neuron and for all the spine heads in a column. Now, what that means is that there's a small fraction, maybe 5 or 10%, that are large. And what we know about them is that they're very robust. They're long-term. This is probably the substrate of long-term the sensory motor coordination that gives you a fast response, right? 1 second or less than a second. Well, what about the 90% here? 90%. Now, what we know about them is they're labile. In fact, they're changing size very rapidly because they're small. Same amount of calcium means that you can change their strength very, very rapidly. And they're actually coming and going. New ones are being formed all the time. There's turnover. And this 90% of all the excitatory synapses in the cortex could be the substrate for long-term working memory because they're available. They're at, and long-term working memory, by the way, you don't want it to be permanent. You want it to be temporary. You want it to go away in an hour or two because you have new things you want to think about, right? So it's got to be temporary. And so what's the mechanism? Well, okay, so let's think about this. Here's an experiment that was done by David McCormick. And what he did was he recorded from a neuron in the cat visual cortex, and he gave it a clip that was repeated over and over again, and he changed the mask. Here we have it covering just the receptive field of 1 neuron, maybe 1 degree, and repeated the clip over and over, and you see you get this beautiful rate-coded, rate-modulated signal. But what happens when you open it up? Well, there's a non-classical receptive field. This is the suppressive surround I was telling you about. And what does it do? It converts it from being a rate code to, as you can see here, of very precise times. This is not 1 spike, but it's like, if you have 20 repeats here, that's 20 spikes on top of each other very reliably. Now, there are other parts of this clip where there's a broader grouping of spikes closer to the rate code. And what this is showing you is that in the real world where you have a full field input, you're going to be getting a mixture of spike timing and rate coding. So it's not one or the other. It's not a dichotomy. You can do both. And you could use them for different things. This is really, I think, for me, this experiment really was eye-opening, literally. Now, if you look at the recordings, what's happening here is as you open it up, you'll see that the membrane potential hyperpolarizes. That's because of the suppressive surround. In fact, if you look at the IPSPs, they're huge. They're huge as you go to full field. And these large IPSPs, as you'll see in a minute, may be what's causing these spikes. The precise timing on the spikes. And this goes back to an experiment that Zach Mainin did when he was in my lab back in the 90s. Instead of giving as you can see here on the left, the traditional, constant current input to get a lot of spikes, which does not preserve timing information after the first few spikes. if you give it frozen noise, if you give it a randomly fluctuating input, similar to what you see if you record from a pyramidal cell in vivo, and repeat that over and over again, you get these beautiful time spikes, millisecond precision. So this is really something that it gets a little closer to what we saw on the last slide. Now, we did spike-triggered averaging, and we varied parameters, but what you can see is that what causes the spike is not necessarily just a depolarizing input, but it's actually a hyperpolarizing input followed by a depolarizing input. And that hyperpolarization, we know, we've modeled it with Hodgkin-Huxley kinetics. Normally near thresholds, a lot of the sodium channels are inactivated, Hodgkin-Huxley. But if you hyperpolarize, you de-inactivate, which means that now an excitatory input will recruit more sodium channels, and that means you can very precisely, within a few milliseconds, have a spike. Okay, so this is what's going on when the wave goes across the cortex. It's actually hyperpolarizing, causing spikes at a particular time. And what do we know about timing? Well, there's a whole plasticity mechanism that's been known since the 1997, actually, when the classic paper by Henry Markham and was published in Cortex, recordings from Cortex. This is from the hippocampus, where a slice recording. And what they did was they gave it the two neurons simultaneously recorded. They stimulated the presynaptic input with a time delay. You stimulate the postsynaptic cell, and you pair that at frequencies ranging from 2 hertz up to 40 hertz in their paper. But you can see here in bursts, we'll see in a minute. If you do that and repeat the burst, you can very rapidly change the strength of the synapse, pre, before, post, factor of 2 increase. But if you reverse the order and give it post, before, pre, and do that pairing over and over and over again, you can decrease the strength by, and the window is plus or minus 20 milliseconds. But even more importantly, look at the knife edge here between depression. That's amazing. How could you possibly make, if you have a rate-coded system, how could you possibly make a fine temporal distinction in the millisecond range? Well, you can, it turns out, with traveling waves, because it's a wavefront that moves through. This is from the actual discovery paper at Sockbun's lab. And I just want to point out one thing, which is that the actual stimulus they used was bursts of 5 pairings at frequencies ranging from 2 hertz to 40 hertz. And this is the increase in the EPSP amplitude. No change at all at 2 hertz and 4 hertz. But if you get to 10 hertz and above, it climbs up to 40 hertz. From 25% increase up to 50% increase. So this is really telling us something, because this is exactly the frequency band that you see for traveling waves in the cortex, right? And the burst lasts for like 5 pairings. That was repeated every second, and for 10 bursts, 10 bursts, in order to get something that they were able then to quantify, as you can see here, LTP, LTD. It's actually not, they didn't look at beyond an hour, and they didn't really focus on smaller numbers of bursts. And it turns out that if you only have a few pairs, it only lasts temporarily for maybe 10, 20 minutes. And if you have more bursts, you can build up for hours, but it's not long-term. And that's really what we need for long-term working memory. We need something that's temporary. So this is a good candidate. Now, okay, I've been talking about long-term working memory. What's the evidence that there's any connection between traveling waves and working memory? Well, it turns out that back in 2022, Earl Miller, and I was at MIT last week, so I talked to him, and he's doing some fantastic new work. And he has a new paper that just came out in Neuron. I highly recommend it. But this is a classic working memory task, delay match a sample. What is it? You give it a sample, you have a delay period that lasts for 2 seconds, and then you give it a choice between what they saw and something else. You have to look at it. So here now are 4 different frequency bands, alpha from theta, 4 hertz up to gamma, 40 hertz. And you can see there's a burst. When the test stimulus comes on, you get a burst of activity, which turns out to be a traveling wave across the cortex. So this is the amplitude, just like you saw for the hippocampus. And here's the phase going across. And here's what you see if you for this particular line across the array, you can see that it's the phase changes in a very regular fashion across that array. So here's the working hypothesis, and I have written, I have this is an essay that was meant for the public. Okay, it's in the transmitter with the Simons Foundation, has a bunch of essays, and its essay is about thinking about thinking. And here's the hypothesis: that there are two tiers. That there's a fast sensorimotor processing, which is carried by a rate code. That's fairly well established. And this is what's been built up. You know, this is your survival depends on it. It's got to be very reliable, right? But you also need to do temporary thinking. And this is done, according to the hypothesis, by first traveling waves, which induce spike time dependent plasticity that lasts for hours through spike timing. Okay, so it's a working hypothesis. We'll see. It has a lot of predictions, and so that's something that my lab will be working on over the next few years. Now, but there's another offshoot, which is something which is really quite remarkable, which is that these traveling waves can be global, as you'll see in a minute. And there is a theory for perception and consciousness called the global workspace theory. Bernie Bars came up with this. He's a psychologist, but a lot of evidence has accumulated stand to hand using EEG. And this is, and I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. But it's an idea that how do you organize information globally? Now, there is another twist, which is that if you look at the transformer, you notice that there is a multi-headed attention. What is that? Well, it has nothing to do with attention in the neuroscience sense, but it is important because what it does is it allows you to look at associations between words that could be at some distance apart, and you learn the weights. It's a matrix. It's basically n squared matrix where you have n words coming in to the window. Now, this is this diagram here is very misleading because it looks like the whole thing is feed forward. No, it's not, because if you look at it, you can see that the input is actually shunted. And so it goes through the multi-head attention and is mixed with the incoming information. And that's then put into the feed forward chain. So it's a matrix. It associates words across inputs. And it really is what could be called temporal context. And this is the key thing in this whole process here of trying to understand long-term working memory. So what is temporal context? Okay, so here's a sentence. Bob, who is hopeful, likes Alice. Well, is hopeful attached to Bob or is it attached to Alex? Well, in the association matrix, these two words have a positive association, and these two words have a negative association. Well, you build that up through learning. Learning, it requires a lot of training, right? Pre-training. Well, Christopher Wray, engineer at Stanford, replaced self-attention with this matrix. It's called the Hippo matrix. You'll notice something about it, which is that it's called a state space model. It's the same kind of state space model that's found in signal processing and control theory. But you'll notice it has the same structure that we saw earlier on the cortical architecture and also in Andy Keller's traveling wave model. Okay, so that's interesting. So what did they show? Well, first of all, okay, this is a class of matrices called tuplet matrices, right? So this is interesting that there's a class, and it's known that tuplet matrices, what they're doing is temporal convolution. You can use it for Fourier transforms. You can use it for any kind of convolution. And in particular, you can get traveling waves out of it. So you put that in, by the way, there are only n parameters, so that means that you have a lot less training, it's faster in terms of the inference. They call it Mamba. They vary the size, the number of weights from 130 million up to 2.8 billion on a whole series of tasks that were benchmarks. And well, I'm not going to show you. They compared against GPT and a bunch of others. But what you can show is that the best performance of all of these across all the sizes in bold is their Mamba. Okay, that's something everybody likes to see in their paper, right? That we could do better than anybody else. But the point here is that it takes literally much less time to train, and inference is much faster and cheaper. Okay, so is there a way of thinking about self-attention? Well, it turns out that this whole loop here between the output and the input is something we see recapitulated in the brain between the cortex and the basal ganglia, which is topographically mapping the cortex. And it's known that the basal ganglia projects back to the cortex. There's a loop here about 100 milliseconds, and it's important for learning sequences of actions. It's actually the kernel for reinforcement learning, the dopamine neurons. We know a lot about that. So let's go back to our this is the stack. It's a feed-forward network, but as you can see, if you look at these two, concatenating two, and if you look at these two, you can see that there's a feed-forward pathway through this whole thing on the top here, and then there's a parallel pathway here of self-attention. And if you concatenate now a pair of those, what do you get? You get two streams. So it's a feed-forward stream, and then there's a self-attention stream, and they interact with each other, right? Just like the basal ganglia and the cortex. So this could be, the basal ganglia could be doing something for, our, not just reinforcement learning, but something very important for long-term working memory. And especially the mechanisms that I showed you earlier. This is unpacks it the way a neuroscientist would look at it. You have a hierarchy of cortical areas. You have oscillations and traveling waves, and every one of them, they have the feedback connections, inputs from the thalamus, topographically organized, and also topographically organized projections down the basal ganglia. And we know that there are traveling waves in the basal ganglia too. So, and it loops back to the cortex, So this, I think this architecture here, we had a TINS paper that came out just last year, which really, I think, is giving us a new perspective on the basal ganglia. It's maybe doing something really important, not just for learning sequences, but also for helping the cortex sort out the relationships between inputs over time. So back to the global workspace. So here's the basic idea that goes back, as I said, to Bernie Bars. So you have a sensory input, and now you're going to give a very low contrast so that you only perceive it half the time. Okay. Now you separate out the ones where you perceived it. You can see that you get a huge amount of activity in the prefrontal cortex here, up on the top here, consciously perceived. And the idea is that you ignite it, and that there's feedback that then could cause more activity in the back of the brain, as well as the front. But if you don't perceive it, it just peters out. You get a little bit of activity, but there's no feedback. This is the kind of the concept. But it could, even if it works for perception, it might actually work for what I call self-generated activity that happens when you're thinking, that you have this global workspace. When is it that you get global activity? Well, it turns out when you fall asleep, your brain goes into a state, this is called a sleep spindle. It's non-REM sleep. Sleep spindle lasts for about 2 seconds. It's 10 to 14 hertz. It's shown in red here. It occurs thousands of times. There's these bursts that occur thousands of times. We can record from human cortex in epilepsy patients, and this is an array of 100 electrodes. And what we're going to do is show you the phase of the wave as it courses across the cortex, and that's actually superimposed here. The one with the red dot is this one. But you can see that the phases are different. And so the question is, are they randomized phase, or are these phases in some orderly fashion? Here's the movie. Just, follow the white paths as they go from the temporal cortex up to the parietal cortex to the prefrontal, T, P, F. And it does that about 20 times on a single spindle, 20 times. Now, here's what we know about these spindles, is that they're really important for consolidating long-term memory. The more spindles you have, the more you remember of what you were taught just before you fell asleep. So this is very interesting, because it might mean that we know during this time, the hippocampus is talking, is a structure which can take in experiences during the day and then download them into the cortex at night, perhaps for changing strengths of the connections by virtue of the fact that you have a very orderly sequence here during the sleep spindle, which leads to a very orderly sequence in the cortex. This is cortical, but we see similar kinds of activity patterns in the hippocampus. Now, these are epilepsy patients. It could be that this is an artifact? Well, we collaborated with April Benasich at Rutgers. She records from babies, infants that are 8 months, from 6 months to 18 months, high density EEG. And we were very interested. They have very thin skulls. In fact, it's cartilaginous at that point. So recording from the surface of the head here is almost as good as actually recording directly from the cortex for a baby. And babies love to sleep. So we got a lot of data, a tremendous amount of data. So what does it look like? So here's the array. And again, it's coded with white +1 and black -1. First of all, it's bilateral here across the cortex. And you can see it's coordinated across the cortex. It's a swirling traveling wave. And this is going on all the time, right? So this is really, really, I think it's a global traveling wave, and it has something to do with large scale activity in the cortex that might be important for long-term memory. Okay, so here it is. Let me wrap it up. We filled in the black hole with two mechanisms. One, traveling waves that might take you from seconds to minutes, and then a spike time dependent plasticity, which were thought to be a mechanism for long-term memory, but maybe it's temporary memory lasting hours. And again, this is something that we've known about for a long time. These are pieces of the puzzle. I'm putting them together, and there's a lot of interesting consequences and a lot of actual data that's out there that points in this direction. So here are the collaborators. Lyle Muller is the one who did the work I showed you with the traveling waves during sleep, spindles. Pat Churchland, going back to the 90s, we wrote a textbook of computational brain, but we continued to collaborate, and she was a co-author on the TINS paper. Here's April, who did the experiments on the infants. And then interesting, Max Welling is a really well-known machine learning person, and I bumped into him at a NeurIPS meeting. This was in New Orleans a couple of years ago. And I asked him, Max, what are you working on? He said, I'm working on traveling waves. We think traveling waves might be really cool as an inductive bias for recurrent networks. I said, well, I'm working on traveling waves too. And so we collaborated, and it really set off a very, very productive set of interactions, which continues today. So that's the story. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, that was terrific. Thank you very much. I will open the, we don't have that much time for questions because we started late. I'll open the discussion right away. And as usual, if hands don't pop up right away, either in here locally or out there. Okay, there is one. Good. Jonathan, it's yours.
Okay, thank you for the great talk. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Okay, I have one question because I'm also really interested in this long-term working memory thing. And I think it was, it is thought like in the traditional psychology literature to be a hugely important aspect of human expertise. So the extent to which we can use long-term working memory and integrate it with actual long-term memory seems to be like dependent on how much previous knowledge I have or like structures I have already formed. So I would be curious about your thoughts about this, like under which conditions can I actually employ long-term working memory, and under which conditions do I just forget immediately?
Well, I think if you just want to remember random things like phone numbers, you have to rehearse it. It's not going to last more than 10 seconds or something, or 20, a minute. Let's say a minute. But if you rehearse it, if that's for random stuff. No, but things that are something that you know about, from your knowledge store, that can be retrieved and extended. Now, if I had given my lecture in Chinese, how much of it would you remember? Obviously, you have no knowledge of Chinese, so there'd be nothing, zero, maybe a couple of phrases or something, that I'm using in English. But absolutely essential. You're right. Long-term memory is a partner with a long-term working memory, and it's really the interaction between the two that creates thoughts. And you know, it's just like apparently my lecture stimulated your knowledge of a particular part of psychology. Same thing happens. By the way, this is something that large language models can't do. You know, when you have a dialogue, you know, you go back and forth, the long input vector gets longer and longer and longer. And so you have the impression that, my God, it's understanding me and it's answering questions and so forth. But the moment that you stop the dialogue, it goes silent. There is no long-term working memory there. There's no self-generated activity. So, I mean, this is the most important difference, is that it can't think. Literally, it can't think like the way humans do. And I think that, you know, long-term working memory is going to be the solution.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, to fill in the gap, what's the relation between this kind of rehearsal in time and self-reinforcement, if any?
Okay. So, okay, Roger and I published a paper back in, oh my God, we're 90s. It was in neural computation. What we showed was that STDP, spike time dependent plasticity, is actually a millisecond version of the reinforcement learning algorithm that Rich Sutton came up with, which is the temporal time dependent reinforcement learning, temporal difference learning algorithm. It's the same thing. So it turns out that reinforcement learning is actually using the same computational trick. And here's why I think that it's important, because it happens over and over again. You know, large language models just have to predict the next word, right? And it uses the difference between the word that it actually was in the sentence and what its guess was, to be able to update all the weights. So all you need to know is of short-term predictions, and that builds up. And temporal difference learning is just the same thing. The dopamine neurons are reporting on the reward prediction error. You get a reward, is it more or less than you expected? And on the basis of the difference, no difference, no change. You can use that information in order to improve your value function. The value function is keeping track of all the experiences you've ever had, right? Very important, because that's what you're using for making fast decisions. So I think this is all part of a general principle. It has to do with how you use predictions, short-term predictions, to produce long-term changes in the weights.
Very interesting. We have a lot of, not a lot, a certain number of the speakers in this series present here for your talk. So I really encourage them to interact with you now while we're in the right temporal phase for that interaction. And I invite in particular, there he is. Okay, but I was just going to invite Munir to go ahead and do that. Oh, by the way, before you do, Bernie Bars spoke in this series about a year and a half ago, and he sometimes shows up. I would like to have him here today as well. Go ahead, Munir.
Okay. Well, I have mainly clarifications, because I'm not sure I understood the presentation correctly. At one point, you have a slide that seems to claim that in the transformer, self-attention and the feed-forward network that's in the block run in parallel. I'm not sure I see that. And then you make the analogy with the cortico-basothalamic area running in the same pattern. My understanding is that in the transformer, attention and the feed-forward actually run in sequence. And the cortico-basothalamic area is actually a feedback loop. There is nothing running in parallel there.
Well, so first of all, the cortex has a hierarchy. Well, so does the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia is running in parallel. They run in parallel, but there's a loop between them, right? That's what I had in my diagram. That's anatomy. Okay, I'm just giving you anatomy. Now, what wasn't known is that what exactly is being transmitted down and what's going on in the basal ganglia. And it's clear that what's going down is not point by point, like for the retina into the visual cortex. It's actually a broader spread of information crossing cortical boundaries. And that's really important because you want to be able to link together information across time. It takes 100 milliseconds for the visual input to go up to the prefrontal cortex. Well, that's marching through the basal ganglia because the basal ganglia is getting input coming in. And the basal ganglia can integrate across those cortical areas and help provide information about associations between words. So it's a new perspective on the basal ganglia. This is all speculative, but I'm collaborate with neuroscientists who study the basal ganglia and also cortical neuroscientists to manipulate traveling waves. So now to go back to, let's see, what was the first part of your question? It had to do with
the transformer.
The transformer.
Transformer, you have a slide that says that self-attention and the feed-forward network run in parallel.
Yeah, this is okay. If you unpack the actual connectivity, you see that there are these two streams that they're interacting with each other. There's the feed-forward stream, which is the bypass, going up. And then it's mixed with the at every level with the so-called self-attention. Like I said, this is not attention; it's just association. It should be called self-association. But in any case, and that is providing information about temporal context. And temporal context is really the key. And in other words, in vision, the way that you see things is by spatial context. You compare things across the visual field. And that gives you a sense for where the object is and what it is. Temporal context is equally important. And the problem is that you have for temporal context, you have to be able to hold on to information for a long time to be able to compare a word at the beginning with the word at the end, maybe a word in different sentences, this and that. How do you know what this and that refer to in the previous sentence? You have to use temporal context. And so that's really, I think, the part of the brain we know least about.
I agree with what you just said. What I still don't understand is how that is evident in the transformer architecture, because I guess what you're referring to as parallel processing is the fact that you have those skip connections that kind of go from inputs to like the FFN part of the transformer layer. But those are there just to avoid the gradient disappearance, that's all. They're not there to actually create context per se. And if you look at the FFN...
Why not both? Why not both?
Sorry?
Why not both?
Oh, well, then that has to be demonstrated, and I don't think anybody has done that yet. Another comment I have
predictions.
Sorry?
I'm making predictions.
Oh,
in other words, this is a new idea, and you're absolutely right. You can't just accept it on my word, but it makes a lot of predictions, and they can be tested in the brain. And also, if you look at what Christopher Wray showed us, is that you can replace the self-attention with all the complexity, the KQR, this is all the different parts of it, an end by end matrix. You can replace that whole thing with a traveling wave. And that's what we see in the cortex, right? So it tells you that I think they were on the right track.
Regarding the traveling wave, yeah, I agree with that. But my take on that is that actually it's more of a well, what you refer to as the cortex and the basothalamic area is more of a system of gating where your traveling waves are steered by what goes on underneath in the basothalamic area. But anyways, that's also speculation from my part.
Again, it could be both. I don't see why we have only one function for a particular brain.
Sure. Another question I have is regarding STDP, the experimental evidence. When you try to build neural networks with STDP as a learning rule to, fix the synaptic connections, the results are not that impressive actually compared to just trying to minimize some kind of output error or something like done in backpropagation. So do you have a take on this?
Not only do I have a take, but I have a postdoc who's working at that, Arjun Paravali. And again, what he showed, what he's showing now is that if instead of starting with random connections, you start with this inductive bias, so a tuples matrix that has traveling waves in it, that you can use STDP to be able to remember sequences very quickly, very fast. And so it's something that, AI is completely ignored. I mean, they always start with small random numbers. And, that's probably, if you don't know anything about, what the ultimate connectivity is going to be, but if you actually know that the problem is memorizing sequences and manipulating sequences, not just memorizing, but manipulating sequences, then you should start with traveling waves. And that's been demonstrated over and over again, many, many models out there. And we're just adding this STDP to it now and showing. And by the way, STDP, it actually incorporates a very simple version of causality, right? STDP says that if you have an input coming in that helps to cause an output, and there, if that's true, then you should increase the strength if they're both active at the same time. But if it comes later, then you don't. In fact, you should decrease it. That's STDP, right? So it's a form of miniature version of causality, and it's like I say, I think it's a universal concept that could apply to many, many brain areas. And by the way, it's called the Hep synapse. And, coming up, I always thought Hep said that, well, if they are coincident, if the brain fires, if two neurons fire together, they wire together. That's not what Hep said. What Hep, who's Canadian, by the way, what Hep said was that when neuron A contributes to firing neuron B, you strengthen the synapse. Actually, he had nothing to say about decreasing the strength, but he was very clear about the order.
Yeah.
Right. And so that I think is what the beauty of STDP is. It really takes into account his insight. And by the way, I was asked to write a review article for Neuron on the 50th anniversary of his book, The Organization of Behavior, 49. It was 1999 in Neuron. And I had never read the book, so I did. And I was shocked. I always thought that, this firing together is kind of a way of forming associations. No, I just told you what he actually said. Why did he say that? And the reason is the problem he was trying to solve was how to take a sensory input and maintain it, persistence throughout the cortex over time. And he thought that this learning algorithm could form chains. He called it, I've forgotten the word for it, but in any case, he was looking for something that could coordinate circulating electrical activity is what he's trying to create. And we now can do that. We can build models that actually illustrate that.
Thanks.
Phase sequences, he called them, phase sequences. And, phase is a very important concept in traveling waves, right? So maybe he even knew about traveling waves.
Yeah.
Thanks ever so much. First of all, let me give you a glimpse at over there. That's where Hebb worked. Here in
Montreal
yeah, you're looking at part of the former Royal Vic, and Montreal General is over there, and also
amazing. Amazing.
Also,
okay. Well, that's historical. You should put his office should be a shrine.
I agree.
He's a psychologist. He's a psychologist, but he really saw into the future.
I agree with you, and I'm very grateful for your having virtually come to Montreal. Maybe sometime you can come and see the real thing. And
yes, I would love to come. Yes.
Oh, there's a question out there.
Maybe I have a question.
Say it loud because there's.
You can see me?
I can hear.
Okay. Thank you for your talk, Terence. So I have one question. So regarding the two streams that you evoked, so feed-forward and self-attention within the brain. It seems to me, yeah, that it could shape even our perception of time itself. Because you discussed about the functional implications of this model in the long-term memory, working memory. So maybe speculative, but I was wondering if what can happen if these streams are desynchronized, and for example, the stimuli are decorrelated, are temporally decorrelated with our internal representation of the world, like maybe in schizophrenia. If you think that can have implications in some diseases.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So thank you for that question, because it actually raises something that was my inspiration. So here's what we know about schizophrenia. It's a thought disorder. And one of the things that is very well established is that if you just look at the gamma oscillations, that the in schizophrenia patients, they have lower amplitude, much lower amplitude. Okay, which suggests that the traveling waves are not at full amplitude in the cortex, which suggests that if it's a thought disorder, that maybe those traveling waves have something to do with thought. Now, here's something that really is fascinating. It turns out that there is a drug, a street drug called Special K. And this drug is a party drug. And so they take it at parties on weekends. It causes out-of-body experiences, and you have cognitive thoughts that are, really not just out of the body, but out of your normal thinking. Okay, but it's kind of a fun thing. So that's why they take the drug. It's altering your consciousness. Now, if you take it 2 days in a row, a lot of kids will now come to the emergency room, full-blown psychotic break, indistinguishable from schizophrenia. In other words, they have disoriented. They can't put together sentences. They have delusions of grandeur. It's like the phenotype is what you see in real schizophrenia patients. The difference is that after a couple of days, it goes away. Whereas for schizophrenia, it's a lifetime sentence. Now, we actually know a lot about what this Special K is ketamine. Ketamine is a drug that's used for anesthesia, but at lower doses, it causes these cognitive side effects. So what is it? And we actually have a mouse model, something I worked on in my lab about 10 years ago. What it does is it knocks down the feedback loop for gamma, the parallelobumin positive basket cells that form a feedback loop with the gamma, with the pyramidal cells, and that produces gamma, 40 to 80 hertz. So here we have the smoking gun, I think, which is that we have a way of manipulating with a drug a particular circuit in the brain that's really important for thinking, right? Now, that's, the ketamine is a dirty drug. It does a lot of other things. So we really need to have a better way of being able to manipulate the inhibitory neurons. There are like dozens of different types of inhibitory neurons. So this is one special type. And so that can be done now with genetically encoded ways of either suppressing or activating neurons. And so we'll know the answer to that. I'm collaborating with Mark Snitzer at Stanford for who's one of the leading labs for being able to do those experiments. This is now, I think it's become time. I showed you Earl Miller's results from prefrontal cortex. Now this is really the highest level of thinking we know. And we see traveling waves, and they're not just, I didn't mention this, but I mentioned it briefly, that even without sensory input, you have spontaneous waves going back and forth. And we think that's a substrate for thinking when, you're planning. you're thinking about the future, you're bringing up things from long-term memory, coming up with a plan. You know, this is something where, you know, it has missing pieces that we're going to fill in, but those missing pieces are going to be critically important for directing us in the right direction. Now, one last comment. Francis Crick was a colleague for many years, and he used to come to tea every day. My lab had an afternoon tea. And one day we were talking about modeling, you know, computational models of the brain. And he said, Terry, you know, models are not an end in themselves. And, you know, for me, they are, because I publish papers, right? That's the output from my lab. And no, he said, no, Terry, you don't get it. That the purpose of a model is to come up with a killer experiment you wouldn't have thought of doing, but when you do it, it gives the game away. That, I think, is where we are heading. Is we want to be able to make predictions. We want to be able to design these experiments that otherwise nobody else would have done.
Okay, thank you. We're well into, Irina, don't leave. We're well into overtime now, and I can't end it without giving Irina a chance to have her say.
Hi, Irina.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for amazing talk. And it's great. It's also recorded because, yeah, I want to make sure my whole lab listens to that. You made great, I mean, there are multiple great points, but one is kind of resonating really well. You said at the very end that unlike human thinking, those models, they need to get a prompt essentially to start thinking. And if there is no input, no prompt, they just idle, nothing is going on. And that seemed to be indeed the main difference, because like we have our brain dynamics even if we sleep and there are no prompts. So do you think that some form of, I don't know, reservoir type of a network flavor of transformer or something like that is the next step? Like, how do we make them think while they are, well, sleeping or not talking to us? Like, I don't know, have you thought about like, what can we do about that?
Yes. Okay, thank you. So how do you make a transformer self-generative? Well, what we know that you can replace the self-attention with a tuplets matrix. And by the way, the beauty of the tuplets matrix is that you can actually analytically solve those state space models. And so that means it's really efficient. But we need to extend we have to incorporate into the transformer fast weight changes, right? The equivalent of the STDP. And like I say, Arjun Karuvali in my lab is doing that now. And so it's working beautifully. So I'm pretty sure if we add in, if we put in traveling waves, and that's already been done, and we now can adjust the weights, tweak them, I would say. You're not going to, it's not long-term memory we're talking about here. We're talking about temporary memory. But the point is, if you tweak them with this STDP algorithm, then you can have a dialogue that could extend working memory, huge working memory. But then you're going to have to add, if you really want to have lifelong learning, you're going to have to add a hippocampus. So that's another missing piece. And doing the feedback, the network will have to go to sleep. If you really want it to continue to learn, it'll have to go to sleep. It'll have to then be tweaked and things put into it which are not going to interfere with the problem right now is if you start training a transformer at the end with new things, you degrade the performance on things that were pre-trained. And so you have to find a way of getting around that, and nature has. So there's a bunch of things that need to be added, but look, this is going to take decades. This is not going to happen overnight. Any new technology, at first blush, you're not going to solve the whole problem first off, but we made the first step. Now we have decades ahead. We have, by the way, students out there, You know, you're living in a different universe than I grew up in. You have an incredible opportunity ahead of you to basically be involved. And it's like the early days of quantum mechanics. Like it's a whole new way of looking at, you know, not just the universe, but, you know, the mechanisms in the universe. And that led to incredible discoveries, Nobel Prizes. And that's going to happen. It's going to take decades. It's not going to happen overnight. And, you know, there's, you know, right now there's just so much excitement and so much money going into this. You know, it's overkill. We're not there yet. We still have a lot of basic research that needs to be done.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you pretty much pointed at the continual learning efforts, and yeah, people were trying to do that. But essentially, yeah, the adaptation without forgetting or without much forgetting, and the loop between hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. Again, people by that analogy try to do continual learning, and that's why replay and so on. So, but it's still, I think it is very important, but still, to me, what's missing is this ongoing dynamics within the network without input.
Right.
Whatever way you implement it, because then you really have your internal, then the system is alive in a sense. Right now, it's still.
In other words, what you have to do is continue the loop.
Yeah.
And you have to have, and you have to have fast weight changes occurring so that you can now begin to reorganize things. And the key is only holding on to information, because it's, you know, the sensory overload that we have is really too much. We don't want to remember everything, but figuring out what's important, that has to be done first, attention, and then figuring out, you know, do the minimum long-term changes in the network. We're, you know, in the baby, it's you know, first year of life, and there's tremendous synaptogenesis taking place, and just sucking up all of the complexity of the world, the language that the baby is hearing. All of that has to be done during the first year or two. And it's then what happens after that is that in addition to those mechanisms, you then have a layer of neuromodulation. Again, it's not in I don't see neuromodulation in the large language model, but neuromodulation regulates like a gate that helps you decide what's important. So there's a lot of mechanisms here that are missing.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, the only minor thing I disagree with, I think it may take less than several decades, but we're not going to get into AGI discussion right now.
Because, you know, I only have a couple decades left.
I think it will be faster. We'll get to basically self-improving loop with those systems, and they improve their architecture. But
I'm afraid I have to call overtime over here. Let me end on a personal note. It's been a long time, Terry, since we were in the same physical space in Princeton. But this is a nice climax that you brought here in virtual space in Montreal. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I'm really pleased. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I think it's great that you've created a forum that the whole world can take advantage of.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, bye, everybody.